So yeah, as you said, I'm David Mulder. I've been working on group policy, unfortunately, for like the past 10 years. um, to some of you, that's a good thing, maybe not to some others. Today, I just wanted to give an update of what's new this year, improvements. Honestly, a lot of the improvements are just bug fixes. There's some new documentation. Talk about what group policy is, briefly, for anybody who doesn't know. And I'll go through some simple use cases. I'll do a demo. My demo's recorded because I didn't want it to blow up in my face. That has happened to me a couple of times, so I've learned from my mistakes, and it is a recorded demo. Talk about integration, the best practices for creating group policies and managing and troubleshooting them. So an introduction. So group policy, you'll see, is kind of this centerpiece in the diagram. You've got Active Directory, and you need to be able to manage your machines and your users within your organization. So group policy governs those computers and users and how they interact. On the left side, you'll see there's the computer settings. These apply to all computers inside the organization or inside an organizational unit or a domain. These can, in Linux group policy, that can be firewall rules, certificates, sudoers, etc. On the other side, you've got your user settings, which apply to individual users within an OU or a domain. These settings could include things like scripts and drive maps. As it shows, it's kind of, the group policy is a centralized location for creating and managing policies. It enables administrators to create, manage, and deploy policies from a single location in a domain. It reduces the risk of misconfiguration and it eliminates inconsistencies. In addition, it provides centralized management. So what is a group policy object? So the difference between a group policy and a group policy object is that group policy is a framework for managing and configuring settings and while a GPO or group policy object is a specific collection of the settings that are applied to a group of machines or servers or users. So group policy includes the infrastructures and tools for distributing and applying those policies. A GPO, on the other hand, is a specific set of settings, and you could think of it as kind of like if you think of group policy as a work order, a group policy object is like a filled out copy of the work order that's deployed on your sysvol, and that work order is then distributed to all of the clients in the domain. So Samba has provided group policy client support since 4.14. It was pretty basic then. Only recently I've added group policy user support. Well, that was only added in 4.18-ish. Maybe 4.17. It's meant to be similar to proprietary tools out there like Ventilla and Centrify. These provide the same kind of features, but the source code is proprietary. It provides easier integration for Linux clients in a Windows environment. There's already a lot of policies available in Samba, and administrators can actually create custom group policies, and I provide documentation that shows how you do that. the list of current policies that are available in Samba, we've got script policies that basically apply cron jobs to the machine. You've got the Kerberos and password policies that apply just to an ADDC. You've got startup scripts. Sudoers is an important one. Configures your sudo rights on the machine. Certificate auto enrollment distributes certificates. That's a whole nother topic unto itself. Browser policies currently we apply to Chrome, Chromium, and Firefox. Firewall policies for Firewall D. There's GNOME settings I added a year or so ago for deploying dconf settings. Message of the day issue, smb.conf. PAM access, that one's an important one that lets you configure who has access to the machine. There's a files policy that deploys files. OpenSSH, symlinks, and then drive maps has not merged yet, but hopefully it'll be in 4.19. Drive maps is meant to be similar to similar to the experience Windows users see, where it's going to map a machine and it'll show up in like in Nautilus. So latest developments. So probably the biggest thing that happened this year, but it's not super obvious to those who use it, is improve the cleanup process to prevent the tattooing of policies. A policy that tattoos is when you distribute a policy and then it never goes away, even if you disable that policy. A disabled policy should be removed from clients. And there were some issues with tattooing of policies when you had multiple GPOs applied and you removed like one in the middle or something. And so I've made some major improvements in that area, which will help prevent a lot of that from happening. I don't think it's perfect yet, but it's a lot better. As a process of writing some documentation, I fixed about 1 million bugs. Douglas knows because he had to review them. Maybe not 1 million, but there were a lot. And then I not eliminate, but changed up the back end. So it was previously for the Samba developers in the room, we were using the ADS code to fetch the list of policies, and this was prone to be really buggy, and so I swapped it out and wrote a bunch of Python code, which will be in 4.19, which eliminates the old ADS backend and uses SamDB instead. This fixes some bugs that were open in the community that people were seeing weird issues with policy application. Specifically with user policy application in certain environments, it was the ADS code was just blowing up, and I don't know why. So I just ripped it out. So yeah, most of the changes were about improving reliability of the existing policies and improving documentation. So the Drive Maps client-side extension, it gives you the ability to use Drive Maps to mount S&B shares. It actually uses the existing Windows group policy that's currently available in the group policy management extension. And these S&B shares that you specify in GPME can now be applied, or will soon be able to be applied, hopefully in 4.19. It's using the GIO mount command, so it shows up in your favorite file browser as a mounted share. It also is persistent because the way I've set this up is that it uses cron jobs to make sure that mount stays active even after a reboot. which might be a little bit annoying, because if this policy is applied to your machine, even if you remove the mount, it will return quickly. But that's kind of the point of group policy, is to enforce corporate policies. But yeah, the point is to make it similar to what a Windows user would experience when they have this policy set up. So use cases. I wanted to point out the security implications of this of group policy. It allows you to control who has access to your Linux host. So for example, the first one we've got here, we've got SSH policies. By controlling access to the SSH server, administrators can limit who is able to connect to the host and reduce the risk of unauthorized access. You can distribute a policy, for example, that forbids root login via SSH. You've got your firewall policies, which uses the firewall D service to lock down ports. You can restrict access to certain ports or services, which allows administrators to reduce the attack surface on the machine. And then you've got access policies. That's the PAM access policies. They control who has access to the host using PAM. Allows administrators to limit the ability to log in and who can perform actions on the host. And then, of course, we've got sudo policies, which will control who has access to root, which limits the potential damage that a malicious actor can do if they do gain access to the system. And the overall important thing here is that this is all centrally controlled. You don't have to go to each and every single machine in your domain and individually configure them. I mean, anyone could do this on each machine one at a time, sure, but if you've got a policy you need to deploy immediately, like revoking access to a specific user, or user account, etc., you can deploy this rather quickly to every machine automatically. So I'm going to show you a demo. My recorded demo is going to show some of the basic security policies that I just mentioned. Here you go. For this demo today, I'm going to demonstrate 4 different policies: sudoers, OpenSSH, PAM access, and firewall policies for Samba's group policy. I've got 2 shells open to a virtual machine that is joined to an Active Directory domain. I have a regular user shell and a root shell both open. I'm going to start off with the sudo policy, and when I do the sudo policy, I'm going to first disable the default configuration, which grants everyone sudo access by default. This is something you have to configure manually. Then I'm going to switch to a user shell, and let's look first at the group policies on this domain that apply to this machine. We have a single group policy, just the default domain policy that applies. We'll put all of our policies there this time. So let's go ahead and define a sudo rule against that default domain policy, which grants everyone sudo rights to update the system without a password. That rule there says that everyone has access to run the zipper update command, which on OpenSUSE will run an update. And if we now take a look at our RSOP, I'm going to a root shell for that. You can see that we've added that policy. It's not been actually applied to the system yet, but it is set on the sysvol, and that's what this reflects, and it applies to this machine, and that's why it shows up here. So let's go ahead and force apply that policy as root. Now, if you've configured Winbind properly, this will happen automatically in the background, but I'm just forcing it now for demonstration purposes. Now, if we take a look
in our group policy cache, you'll see that a single sudoers entry file was created. I dump the contents of that. You'll see that in etc sudoers d, we've created this entry. If we go back and as our regular user, we now run sudo user bin zipper update, we have rights to do an update. I'm not actually going to do that right now. And just to test, sudo echo. And let's see if it allows that. And it does not. See, all other rules are all other operations are denied for sudo. All right. Let's add a second rule that grants the system domain administrator sudo access to all commands. That rule is going to look like this. We're using the Samba tool GPO manage command, which lets us apply policies on the sysvol. Now, if we go ahead and list the contents of that policy using the sudoers list command, we'll see that we've got both of our policies listed there. And if we go back to our RSOP, we'll see that they have been both pushed to the sysvol and they do apply to this system. We dump our cache again. We still have that same file there. It hasn't applied yet. We actually need to force it. So if we force and apply, there we go. Now we have a second sudoers entry that's been applied, and as you can see, it's the administrator rule. Now if I SUSE that user, and we'll see that that user has sudo rights to do whatever without a password. All right, let's move on, and next I'll show you the SSH policy, and let's restrict SSH login and prevent root from SSHing into this machine. So we will set the permit root login to no, that option in OpenSSH. Now, when I run these commands here, they're pushing these policies to the sysvol. These aren't actually putting them on the system. Now, if we list the contents of that policy, we'll see that it's been set. Again, that's on the sysvol, not on the local machine yet. We have to go back to our root console and force that policy. And after we force the policy, we will see that it's been applied. If we take a look in our SSH config, we can see that that policy has been forced on the system. So now root cannot log in via SSH. It's forbidden. Okay. Now let's move on to PAM access policy, and let's instruct PAM to only permit login for my user account, D Mulder, and for the administrator account. You see that I use my CN name there to add that policy. And I'm adding allow access there. One thing that this policy does is the allow is explicit, but it adds an implicit deny to all else. So keep that in mind. As of Samba 4.18, it does. So let's take a look at what the policy list is currently on the sysvol, and we see both of our PAM policies there have been added. Again, these are on the sysvol now. They are not yet on the system. If we go back to our root shell and we force the policy to apply, and let's do an RSOP just to see what that shows. You can see our access policy has those policies in there and they apply to this machine. So we forced, right? We forced. Now let's dump the contents of our cache and see where these policies got applied. It looks like they are here. And you can see that they do indeed exist, and they've been added into Etsy security access.d. All right, let's move on and do a firewall rule. So I'm going to set a rule that tells firewall D to reject all SSH traffic from external connections. So that rule, I'll just paste it here really quick. That rule looks like this. That's what the rule is going to look like. But I'm going to apply it using the Samba tool GPO load command, which waits for input. And there's my policy. I'm writing to the registry poll file on the sysvol, and then I complete it with an EOF, end of file, and then it prompts for the admin password. And it should have written that now. Let's take a look at our RSOP. But we see that for the external zone, we've created a new rule that rejects all SSH traffic. Now, if we force that policy, and let's dump the contents of our cache. You see that rule has been applied. Now, if we now run the firewall command to list rich rules, you'll notice it doesn't actually work. This is a bug in the firewall command. But if we instead force add the rule, copy this rule here. If we try to force add it, you notice it says that's already applied. And so we've confirmed that indeed our firewall rule has applied to the system. All right, thanks, and we'll continue with the rest of the talk.
All right. You got a question, Volker?
If you want to repeat that, I go without a microphone. Does this only work for configuration styles where you have this .d and then include everything there? So you put into individual files for your snippets?
Yeah, that's how I've got it set up. I mean, what's that?
Repeat the question.
Oh, repeat the question. So Volker wants to know if these policies only work for the type of the policy where it it has access.d or ssh.d, with multiple subfiles underneath. Yes, I could write them to configure it into a single file, but that's much more complex, and this was easier.
So you should add an smb.conf.d.
Perhaps. Right now, the SSH Volker said that that perhaps we should have an smb.conf.d. Right now, the way the SSH policy, not SSH, the smb.conf policy works is that it opens the smb.conf, parses it using the Python load param code, and then changes the policies, sets the policies, and then writes it back out, which messes up formatting and comments and things. So it's ugly because of that. So yeah, a smb.d would be really nice. It would make this a lot easier. I believe it's the access policies right now that don't automatically, on most distros, do not automatically read from access.d also. And so that needs to be configured. I think though that I added a check in the policy. I'll have to look, but or at least I was going to add a check to make sure that was there. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, well, so the benefits of this is that when you have a complex environment, the organization receives a number of benefits. You have centralized management in one location for all of those policies, for configuring, creating, managing those policies. You have consistency and standardization. It reduces the likelihood of misconfiguration and inconsistencies. And you have improved security because you're providing granular control over the security policies for both computers and users. So integration, I've mentioned this before. It works with Winbind, of course, just by setting this apply group policies to yes option in smb.conf. As soon as that's set, machine policy applies on a interval, which is actually documented in Microsoft documentation. It follows the same interval. On the other hand, user policy right now only applies at logon time. And speaking of which, I would like to talk to some Samba developers later about this. Because the only reason why, or typically user policy would apply on that interval as well, but the reason why we're only applying it at logon time is because there's no way to tell if the user's logged in from a T event that I've started. Anyway, because it needs to terminate when the user logs off. Also, it can be integrated with SSSD, which I found out was broken a few weeks ago. It's fixed now in master, but so you should know. The caveat is that I don't test this, but I have been told in the past it worked, and I tried it, and it did work. And then somebody pointed out that it broke, and so I fixed it again. But it does work with SSSD. You have to install a separate package called oddjob GP update. And with this, you actually do get consistent policies of application for both user and machine policies. They get applied on the GP update interval. And a side note, you can actually use, if you want your user policy to be applied regularly with Winbind, you can use oddjob GP update paired with Winbind instead, and just disable that apply group policy setting. Otherwise, it'll be applying it more often than it should. And then just a warning, there's a package by the same name in Alt Linux. It's because I swiped it from them. And theirs actually applies different policies because they do something similar in their distribution. Okay, so some best practices. Samba tool is the preferred way for managing Linux group policy. Some of the policies can be managed from the group policy management editor. Not all of them, though. And there are some reasons why. If you've looked into the deep, dark, gritty mess that is group policy, it's disgusting. It's a hash, a random blob of XML files, INI files, registry files. Microsoft cleaned it up, and they only do registry files now, which is way easier to manage. But in the past, a lot of the old stuff, the early 2000s stuff, was kind of messy. No offense to Microsoft, it's just, that that's how development works, right? We have to clean up after ourselves later. So the preferred way is to use Samba tool because it kind of provides a uniform interface. You can use it to create, link, delete, and modify group policy objects. And just to note, you should probably always use the latest version of Samba tool because I'm always adding improvements, fixing things to modify your GPOs. So there are two different subcommands of Samba tool GPO for managing them. The Samba tool GPO command has options for creating, deleting, linking, etc. And then you have the Samba tool GPO manage command, which has some explicit commands that are helpful for certain GPOs. But then there's also the GPO load command, courtesy of Case. He worked with me on that because he noticed a need and made some suggestions, and so we created this command and he tested it. And so these policies here can be managed using GPO load. It can also be used to manage Windows policies, by the way. You can use the GPO load command to export and apply Windows policies. Some common troubleshooting steps. So of course you can review your logs and look for messages from GP update. You saw me using the RSOP command. That stands for resultant set of policy. Some people have confused this for reflecting the policy that is applied to the machine. It actually means the policies that would apply to the machine. So it does not mean that it has applied, it means that it would apply. And that's important because RSOP reflects the policies that you've set on your sysvol that are that will be applied to the machine. It's hard to describe, but some policies that you set on the sysvol do not apply to certain machines or certain users. And so the RSOP command, which you can run for a machine or for a user, tells you what policies will apply. Now, once you've run the force command and applied the policies, then it reflects the policies that have applied, of course.
It's like a dry run from other tools.
Yeah, Enzo mentioned it's like a dry run. Yeah, sort of. It actually parses the policies. It doesn't try to apply them, but it does. It can notify you of problems if there's a problem with your policy. So yeah, it is kind of like a dry run. It does not apply anything, but it tells you what will apply. And then if you're experiencing problems, you see that your policies have not applied to the machine when you expect them to, you can run a GP update force with debug enabled, and it will give you more information about what might have gone wrong. Sometimes there's a crash somewhere within the client-side extension, and that will give you more details. And then finally, there's you can dump the cache. You saw me dumping the cache in the demo video. The cache keeps track of the policies as they were before you changed them and how they are now, and then what you changed, so that it can reverse them. The point of the GPO cache is to prevent tattooing. So, in fact, the improvements I made this past year to prevent tattooing had everything to do with this cache. And then, of course, there's docs available, documentation to help you with the debugging, or you can email me directly because I get a lot of those. Okay, so big new thing this year is that I finally wrote everything down. I did a brain dump, and now you can read my brain dump, and it may or may not be sensible. I do not guarantee it's. I do not guarantee what I wrote, but most of it is helpful. Yes, thanks. It's free as an ebook or PDF, and it's also on a website. It's online. You can use this QR code to look it up, or courtesy of SUSE, I printed a bunch just for fun. So you guys are free to take one. You can buy one of these on Amazon. I put it up there and then charge printing costs, so it's like €3 or something, €4 I think. So if you want your own copy and don't get one here, there you go. The text, I Creative Commons licensed it, and the online version is getting regularly updated. I'm adding stuff as I add new features, adding more details, fixing things when people yell at me in the forums. But that's okay. You can continue yelling at me. I appreciate it. This text copy, it doesn't get updates, obviously, or it will eventually. Okay. So the topics covered in the book is basic management instructions, kind of some of the stuff we talked about here in the presentation. But it gives really specific details about each policy, what it does, how it applies, how to debug the policy if something goes wrong, and how to troubleshoot it. But it also in the back has instructions how to create your own policy. That's there to encourage you guys to make more. Subtle plug there. But you can create your own policy for your own organization. That's one important thing, is that if you may have really specific policies for your organization that aren't necessarily something you want to share with the world, and that's fine. It's just a simple Python script. And later maybe C. I'm working on that. So here's one big question I was talking to some people about recently. Group policy is not an MDM, sorry. It's not mobile device management. There is MDM from Microsoft called Intune, which replaces and kind of complements group policy. There are some big differences between the two, but I've been investigating this and I'm interested in creating an Intune open source client that can deploy policies to Linux machines. Microsoft right now provides a binary, Linux binaries only in Debian format, but they provide Linux binaries for deploying policy to their Edge browser. And right now that's the only MDM Linux option that I'm aware of out there. There may be other things, but that's the only one I'm aware of, specifically with Intune anyway. And so one of my future plans is to look into creating a similar open source tool that lets us apply Intune policies on Linux. So some differences between group policy and MDM, of course, the deployment and management. Group policy is only within an Active Directory domain, whereas MDM is like a cloud thing. You can enroll your personal machine and it applies policies to you based on your organization. Your device ownership, Active Directory devices are usually organization owned versus an MDM device. You may bring your personal Linux laptop and you want to be able to access your VPN, so your employer says, well, you have to apply these policies to your machine. Management capabilities. They're managed differently. Security features, Active Directory. Azure in Active Directory with Intune can provide like biometric auth and stuff, from what I understand. And then of course, MDN has seamless cloud integration and such, which we don't have anything like that yet.